For USCFootball.com, I'm Jack Smith here with Chris Treviño for Instant Analysis after USC's Tuesday morning practice, where we got to talk to Lincoln Riley. Got a little bit more news and notes about the Trojan offensive line, the defensive backs, some notes from Brett Nealon. But overall, what were your thoughts from the USC practice?
Well, the first thing, because I feel like we always do kind of a weather report here, it was a little chilly this morning, Jack. I had to wear a jacket, so that was nice. We've beaten the heat. We're in October, and it was a scout day for the defense as always, so that's where we get the most of our notes, a little bit of the observations. Max Williams had a pick early on. Gary Bryant actually scored a touchdown against the defense, now their best scout offensive player, now that he's redshirting. Dejon Benton had a couple of sacks. Looks like Tyrone Tileni is moving up a little bit. He's back. He's healthy. Was in on 2 sacks against Arizona State, so he's back up top of the rotation, kind of working in there. Still a very heavy rotation, but defense, they're getting after it. This is a Washington State program that has been known for its offense, but a little bit defensive more in 2022, so we'll probably talk about that more tomorrow. But, still preparing for that high-powered, expected Washington State offense.
Now, we did get to hear from Lincoln Riley. Let's start with his comments about something we've talked about a lot the past couple of weeks. It's the offensive line. There were some switches against Arizona State in key positions, other key positions as well. What were your thoughts about Lincoln's comments about the O-line?
Right. The most important thing, I think, was an update on Justin Dieterich, but it wasn't really that of big of an update. He was asked about Justin Dieterich, who did sit out with that leg, ankle. We're not really sure what it is. He just has that wrapped up with that weird-looking band. He was asked about, his status and any concern. He said he didn't really have a clear answer. He was kind of felt like he was taken back a little bit, didn't really know what to say, but he said he's gotten healthier. They're still monitoring him, and it was important that they did get him able to sit against Arizona State and get him closer to 100%. Right now, I would venture he's probably questionable at best for this weekend, based on what he said. Still going to monitor him, still going to evaluate him, but it just sounds like maybe Gino will have another start in the future, especially if you're gearing up for that big Utah game. That's a game you really need Justin Dieterich for. That's a game you want your team captain, your veteran starting right guard. So get him as close to 100 as you can. We'll see how he progresses throughout the week, but it's something they're going to monitor.
You also got a couple news and notes about the left tackle spot. Of course, Bobby Haskins got the start. We did see Cortland Ford return against Arizona State, but then after a holding call, he didn't play the rest of the game. We got some news about why that might have happened, other news about where they think going forward. What did you think about what he said about the LT spot?
Right, we speculated a little bit that, off first reaction on Instant Analysis that night, and then obviously on Tunnel Vision the next day, about maybe we should just pull indefinitely for the rest of the game. Maybe his ankle started bothering him, but Lincoln Riley said, it was nothing essentially that Cortland did. He did have the holding call, but it wasn't like he was penalized for that and they were going to make him sit. They just felt Bobby was playing a little bit better at that point, so they just wanted to roll with Haskins for the rest of the night, and that's kind of what his explanation was. And he said maybe early in my career that would be something he would do, would be pulling a guy after a big egregious penalty and kind of pulling him off of motion and sitting him for the rest of the day. But, he's grown as a coach, so that's not really the case. It was just more they felt like Bobby was playing better, so they wanted to roll with Bobby Haskins.
Another note about Gino Quinones, who came in for Justin Dieterich to play, is I asked Brett Nealon about his performance, because obviously they were playing right next to each other for the game. He said he thought after Gino Quinones calmed down a little bit after maybe the first drive, he played much better. Said there wasn't a whole ton of extra communication needed because Gino has done a good job prepping and was ready for a start. And he says if he starts again in the future, they feel good about the offensive line. Any more thoughts about the O-line before we move on?
Yes, Lincoln was also asked about sort of building that depth out, because depth is something we hit on a lot in the offseason as one of the big, maybe Achilles points for this team if multiple guys on that starting offensive line go down. And, Lincoln said, behind the scenes, obviously there's something we cannot see all the time with our limitations in practice, but they have been building depth with those guys in practice. Mason Murphy, Cooper Lovelace got a shout out. Andrew Millick, and then Gino Quinones obviously took that step forward into being a backup that's got an opportunity. So they're building guys, but obviously we're not going to be able to see that until a game, and you're not really going to know what you have in a backup until you put them under live fire on a Saturday game with those live opponents coming at you and not your teammates. So, you hope that what they're saying is true. They're building the depth. He feels like they're getting better, all those guys I mentioned. So, again, just keep working on it in practice, and, you hope you don't have to, and then just see what happens in a game if something happens in that regard. But right now it's all about getting some blowout wins and getting those guys opportunity in the fourth quarter, late in the third quarter, things like that. But it sounds like they're doing their best to build up that depth in practice.
USC is no stranger to familiarity with other teams they've played so far this year, with an Austin Jones revenge game against Stanford, Eric Gentry playing his former team Arizona State this week. It's no different for Washington State. There's a lot of familiarities, this time with the staff Lincoln Riley has coached with and played with former players and coaches on the Washington State staff. We'll mention tomorrow Alex Grinch was the former defensive coordinator for Washington State, but Lincoln was asked today about some of his friendships, familiarity with some of the Washington State coaches. What did you think about what he had to say on the topic?
The big one is obviously Washington State's offensive coordinator, quarterbacks coach, Eric Morris, who Lincoln Riley was actually his position coach while they were at Texas Tech. So that's his former player. Now going up against him, it would be a battle against Alex Grinch and Eric Morris, a former Lincoln Riley disciple, if you will, as one of his players. But he said he was a fun guy when he was coaching him, a very smart guy, under-recruited guy for them at the Red Raiders, and a really guy you thought would go into coaching. He comes from a coaching background, as most kids out of Texas do. Everyone seems to know some coach or be part of some coaching tree. So he definitely felt like he saw a coaching career, a coaching future in his in Morris's future, and he says he's done a really great job with Cameron Ward and that quarterback, and being multiple and be able to play to the strengths of Ward being a passer. He does have a lot of interceptions on the season, but that's a young quarterback making the jump from FCS to FBS. But they got him on a right track, 4-1, and scoring some points out there in Pullman. So that's going to be an interesting matchup, seeing them come together pregame. And then the other one is obviously Calen Mcguire, who many USC fans will know. He was the offensive line coach for here under Clay Helton for a couple seasons, and people actually like Calen Mcguire because of the development that he had with USC's offensive line and getting them from a inconsistent bunch to a lot more consistent in the air raid offense under Graham Harrell. And people were pointing to the offensive line as, hey, that was one of the bright spots actually of 2021 and 2020. But Calen Mcguire deserves a lot of credit for what he did with that group and kind of moving them along into, Josh Henson, inquiring them. So Calen Mcguire did a lot of setting that foundation, and Lincoln Riley talked with Calen Mcguire. Calen Mcguire was the one who talked to him about Justin Dieterich and hey, that's your fiercest competitor on this team. So Clay was able to give Lincoln Riley a lot of insight into the team and other things like living in Los Angeles, the area, things like that. And Lincoln said you can do that when you take over a program, and the former coaches will tell you all about that, but can you really trust them in that regard? But because that Lincoln was in the trenches, as he said, with Calen Mcguire, he has that inherent trust in Calen Mcguire, so that's going to be another fun reunion to see on the field pregame.
Yeah, Calen Mcguire definitely deserves credit. Produced a couple first-round offensive linemen for the Trojans, and a lot of the offensive linemen that USC fans love to love right now, those were some Calen Mcguire products. You're talking about Brett Nealon, Justin Dieterich, Jonah Monheim, Andrew Voorhees too. Just a lot of offensive linemen right now that were Calen Mcguire disciples just a year ago. So a lot of familiarity between Lincoln Riley and the Washington State staff. I'm sure we'll have more on that tomorrow with Alex Grinch. I'm sure he's going to be asked about it, just as Austin Jones and Eric Gentry have been asked about it so far for their respective teams. So we'll report more on that to you later. Let's move on to what Brett Nealon said to RJ and I about the red zone offense, just about how much they have practiced in the red zone, because USC has been one of the best red zone teams in the country. And also a little note on Lincoln Riley's play calling. What did you think about what Brett had to say?
It's funny because red zone was obviously a huge issue for USC last season. So when people started talking in the offseason about how the players were talking about, we practice red zone all the time, USC Nation, family, whatever they want to call it, was like, yes, practice red zone. And you can tell they're one of the best red zone teams in the country. And, Brett Nealon was asked about, those red zone plays. And obviously Lincoln Riley has not even shown probably a third or a fourth of what he can call in the red zone. And Brett hinted that there are other plays in the bag in the Lincoln Riley toolbox that they can use moving forward. And he called him, quote unquote, the best play caller in the nation. And just got to let that sit a little bit.
He said ever.
Okay. Thank you. You were in the huddle. Why did you throw it to me if I didn't know?
Well, I figured you talk about your part. You'd let me cover my part. But
this is a give and take, Jack. But thank you for calling it out.
Yeah.
Ever is the statement. I apologize. Lincoln Riley is the best play call ever. Just want to let you sit with that for a second. That's a big thing to say in college football with all the great offensive minds that have been here and are coming up the ranks. So Lincoln Riley, according to Brett Nealon, who's had a couple play callers in his day, to call him that's a big thing. And Lincoln Riley's well respected for his offensive mind and his genius. So I don't really have anything because I can't really call that as a fact or anything, but that's just something big to say, and it's interesting to see how much respect his players have. And we've heard it from other players, like just watching him draw on the whiteboard or do anything, they're like just amazed by what he can do. So just like maybe the pinnacle thing we've heard so far from these players hyping up and talking about Lincoln Riley's offensive mind.
This comes a week after, I believe it was Justin Dieterich said that USC has the best coaching staff in the country. So these are the things you at least want to hear if you're USC fans coming from the players. Now, we don't know if Lincoln Riley is actually the best play caller ever. I don't think we'd be the correct people to diagnose it, but you're right. Brett Nealon has seen a lot of offense. He's very impressed by the Lincoln Riley playbook. One thing, though, of the part of that I think is the most of note is we've been speculating this whole season that Lincoln Riley hasn't shown every part of the offense, but we really didn't have anything to prove it. What Brett Nealon said today about the red zone offense is the biggest key indicator that is true, saying that he was asked about, are there any plays that Lincoln has called in the red zone this season that have really stuck out to you? And he said, yeah, there have been some, but there's also a lot of plays that he hasn't called yet, which I think for USC fans kind of confirms the conspiracy that Lincoln Riley hasn't shown the entire offense. I mean, clearly he's got enough plays up in there in that mind to last him a couple seasons, but there still are, according to Brett Nealon, some great ones that haven't been called yet for the Trojans.
Right, and I don't think anyone didn't think that this was the full offense we've seen. There's obviously always going to be some tricks, some aces up the sleeve that Lincoln has, and those are the games. Those are the ones you save for Utah when you really need a score. Those are the ones you save for the Pac-12 championship when you really need a score against whoever you play, or maybe even the playoff. Whatever, you always have to keep those in the bag for those critical do-or-die moments in a season. And I'm sure Lincoln has a nice little list ready to go whenever they need to pull those out.
Now, Brett Nealon was also asked what his favorite karaoke song is, and like he said, karaoke was his hidden talent. He said Love Story by Taylor Swift. So big, mean-looking Brett Nealon on the football field, as we've known for a long time, is a little bit different off of the field. He's got a little fun, lighthearted side to him. Let's get to one more thing. Lincoln Riley talking about the defensive backs and the pass interference calls that I know USC fans weren't too happy about. He straight up said, there were some bang-bang plays that went each way for both teams. He said the call on Jordan Addison, the pass interference that they called when Jordan Addison was going deep in the end zone, that wasn't pass interference. And he also said that on some of the USC ones, it was awesome coverage, and he would take that exact same coverage again, pretty much exactly like he said after the Stanford game. But we got to know a little bit more about what Lincoln thinks about the defensive backs. I'm curious, what do you think about the defensive backs so far and what Lincoln said?
I think the defensive backs are playing great. I think that they've been maybe not underrated, but they're a position that we really haven't been talked about. Mekhi Blackman has been really, really good this season. Sierra Wright has had his moments as well. They've mixed in Damani Jackson, who's getting more playing time. Jacoby Covington coming in as one of those big-bodied defensive backs to handle those bigger wide receivers. I think they've been playing really great, especially after the last couple seasons where they've had some struggles. I think Dante Williams has done a really nice job with this position group. And yeah, Lincoln Riley was a little more neutral than USC fans when they were talking about the calls against the defensive backs. He said, they're bang-bang plays. They happen. We hear that a lot. It's just a judgment call right in the spot. Things happen. You got to make the call, and some are going to go your way, some are not. The ones you have to avoid, obviously, Jack, are the egregious ones. He mentioned that several times. You got to avoid those egregious ones. And there were a couple times he mentioned, he admitted they were a little bit too handsy, and that happens in a football game. But he did mention, if you recall earlier in the preseason, I believe, where sometimes they're going to take those aggressive penalties. Those are okay with them to live by, because football is an aggressive sport. You're going to have those hits. You're going to have those, maybe you're holding the line a little too long, a little too strong there, a little too aggressive, and they'll take those. Those are ones you can live with, because that's a team that's playing aggressive, and you're going to be a good football team if you're playing with some aggression, some edge, and that's kind of what we saw the difference between the defense against Arizona State in the first half. The second half was an edge. So you take that edge, you're going to have some penalties, but those are things they're willing to live with.
And I tend to think if you're not hearing about the cornerbacks, they're doing a pretty good job, because that means you're not hearing about the refs throwing flags, you're not hearing about the announcers saying this is who was beat in coverage. So I think you're right. The USC cornerbacks group has been one of their more underrated groups and has maybe been the most consistent of any group on the defense, with Mekhi Blackman, Sierra Wright, Damani Jackson, all those names that you mentioned. Are there any more notes that you want to talk about before we wrap this up? Head on to tomorrow's practice at night.
No, I mean, I'm just excited to listen to Alex Grinch tomorrow. Obviously, this is a big one for him and facing, his old team. So I'm sure he's going to have a lot to say about it and hear what he has to say after watching the film against Arizona State. But other than that, nope, got nothing else. I'm hungry. I want to go get some lunch and take a nap. So wrap us up, Jack.
Well, I'm with you on that one. Anyways, make sure you guys are checking out the rest of the content on the YouTube channel where we'll have highlights from the games, all that stuff from the game. And then today, we've got all the interviews that happened after practice. And then stay tuned. Tomorrow, we'll have instant analysis. Thursday, we've got a preview show for the game this weekend. And then, hey, by Saturday, we'll have another USC game for Chris Treviño. I'm Jack Smith. This has been Instant Analysis. Check out uscfootball.com for more.